Hello, I'm Master Tay. Welcome to my YouTube channel, History Soup. I'm doing a series of YouTube videos on the history of Superman. Superman happens to be my favorite superhero, and in order to understand, I think to understand any fictional character, you should understand the creator, especially in comic books and literature. The creators, the authors, the artists that creates these wonderful stories that we all enjoy, right? So I'm doing it on Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel. One of the sources I use is it's this one. The artist behind Superman, the Joe Shuster story, is by Julian Volage and Thomas Campy, and I think it's a wonderful book. It's done in a graphic novel type way, and I think that's pretty awesome. It's fitting for the creators who created Superman. Additionally, they give additional information in their bibliography. It's their selected bibliography that gives you even more in-depth information. And a lot of this you can actually look up yourself as well. So that's why, and I always do that with anything I read and stuff. They have sources. I look up those. I like to look up some of those sources to learn more, to grow, but also to get to make sure the information that I'm receiving is accurate, right? So, and primary sources are normally the best sources, right? So to understand Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, because the first video will be on them, I think you have to understand a little bit of their early life. So Joe Shuster was born in 1914 to Ashkenazi Jewish parents, Ida and Julius Shusterowicz. Ida is from Russia, and his family life is actually very, very interesting. I found a lot more information on Joe Shuster's family than I did on Jerry Siegel, but one thing that is very important to understand is that Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel are both Jewish, right? So his mom was an Ashkenazi Jew. He met her husband while escaping with her sister from the Russian pogroms down to Rotterdam. That's where Julius Ostorowicz met Ida, and they would eventually locate to Toronto. And in 1914, they would have a son, and who would become Jerome Shuster, but he would go by Joe Shuster. I believe Joe was short for Joseph, and that was his middle name. And Joe was especially interested in drawing. He got into when he was young. He really enjoyed the funnies, so he would trace the funnies in the newspapers and magazines during that time, and that's how he learned to draw. So, and another influence was, of course, he was very close to his family. Who was his uncle. His uncle worked at a movie theater, and would show him these movies. So he was very, very interested in science fiction. And as I mentioned, their family was very close knit. They were escaping the pogroms. And if you don't know what a pogrom is essentially violent attacks and riots against the Jews during that time period. I think the modern day definition is essentially, this is not the exact definition, but it's simply riots or attacks on a people based off ethnicity, religion, or both ethnicity and religion. So when they moved down to Toronto, and during Joe Shuster's youth, his father has struggled a lot keeping a job, but like I said, they were a close knit family. So when he was in high school, he eventually moved in high school in Toronto. He went to high school, joined the school newspaper they call the Federalist, as I showed you earlier. They would eventually have to move again. Before moving, he met and spoke with his friend by the name of Jerry Fine. Jerry Fine will end up being very important to Joe Shuster, because his Jerry Fine would tell him, "Hey, go meet my cousin. His name is also Jerry," and that's how when he how when Joe Shuster moved down to Glenville, he would meet and befriend and his lifelong friend Jerry Siegel, which now brings us down to Jerry Siegel, because Jerry Siegel also lived a very interesting life. Jerry Siegel was young and impressionist. He was more extroverted than Joe Shuster. He was very confident in his writing ability. But his background and what influenced him, especially in his younger years, was this little newspaper called the Secretary Hawkins Page. It was geared toward little children. He wrote, and that really caught his attention. He wrote to the Hawkins page, and that writing got published. And Jerome Siegel or Jerry Siegel, I'm sorry, Jerome was not Joe Shuster. I misspoke. But Jerome Siegel was Jerry Siegel, and he would it said he would brag that he's been published when he was a child. And again, I'm going to show I'm going to print my photo down so you can see that that letter. This is the letter that he wrote to the Secretary Hawkins Page, and and these influences that really gave Jerry Siegel his confidence, right? You know, sadly for Jerry's later on, his dad would pass away. I know a lot of people have this misconception that he died. His dad died by being shot in a robbery, but that is not true. His dad died during a robbery attempt, but he died of a heart attack. And we know this because around the, I think about 2017, 2016, I'm not exactly sure the year they found his coroner report, but they did find his coroner report, which was eventually published. So we now know how his dad had passed away, and we do have that copy. Here's the if I bring my picture down, you can see that right here, right? You can see the coroner report. You can find that coroner report online as well. In fact, I got that picture from online. Either way, his father's death clearly would have a great impact on Jerry Siegel's writing. I should note that although Jerry Siegel was very extroverted, he didn't talk much about his. Doesn't seem like he talked much about his family. He definitely, according to Joe Shuster, never really talked about his father's death. But as they grew up together, another influence for both Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel was those pulp magazines. That further increased their interest in those science fiction, those adventures and detective stories that they grew up with, right? Okay. All right. And again, these guys were just teenagers, but they were ambitious. Despite Joe Shuster being much more introverted compared to Jerry Siegel, he was just as ambitious as Jerry Siegel. If you're reading their history, but the two of them would eventually, and I am going to pull this one up this one up. They were together. They would together create their own magazine. Called Science Fiction Magazine. They would print their own magazine off their school printer, and they would eventually get to write one of their first example of a Superman, someone that had these extraordinary powers. Reign of Superman was not a superhero. This Superman essentially was a homeless man who was who was a villain, but as a homeless man, he was taken by a scientist, experimented on, and through these experiments, he gained these mental powers. He had like telepathy, he could control people's mind and mess with people's mind, and he would actually kill the creator, the man that gave him these powers. Eventually, he would lose those powers, and he would not be able to regain his power because he killed the creator. I look at it, and it's kind of funny because I think he not only does he kind of reminds me of Lex Luthor, but he also kind of reminds me of Professor Xavier. Professor Xavier became evil, So I thought that was pretty interesting. Pretty interesting, and then but yeah, that was their first ideal of Superman, and together they would continue to work on this Superman concept over their life, right? They would but so they would create this ideal. Jerry Siegel would send these ideals to publishers, and they were getting rejected. They were getting rejected over and over and over again. And eventually, Jerry Siegel thought, well, maybe I'm getting rejected because Joe Shuster's just not as famous of an artist. He wouldn't try to necessarily hurt his friend, but he felt that maybe if he got a more famous artist to help him with his concept, his work, then maybe he'll be able to get published. Because remember, both these individuals are fairly ambitious, but Jerry Siegel was really focused on being that writer, being of those pulp magazines. So he did send a letter, which I'm going to pull up as well. And he did send a letter. And so he sent this letter to one such artist, and Mr. Keaton. He was actually pretty gaining pretty popular at the time, but eventually that would fall through as well, and then he would eventually go back to Joe Shuster, right? And they would make up, and they would continue their writing and art publishing endeavors to be published, right? So eventually, now I'm not going to go into too much detail. Again, I suggest you reading these books, but eventually they would find their way to well, actually they first, I think it's like Fun Magazine, or I forgot the name of the magazine, but prior to National Comic, they would indeed create a superhero, essentially a character, and it predates Superman himself, by the name of Dr. Occult. So I am going to pull that one up as well. So this was Dr. Occult, made by I don't remember the exact name. It's like Fun Magazine. Apologize, but he would become part of this company. Would fold under National Comics and DC eventually. But this individual predates Superman by about a few years. He was made in 1935, and he was like a detective, kind of like a paranormal detective, but he would use like magical items and stuff. And then, so again, it can be argued that Superman was not the first costume superhero, but it can be argued that Superman was definitely the most popular that came out, because that was also made by Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel. And so it's that iconography that Superman was wearing this bright, colorful costume. I mean, he's the one that's credited with really starting the comic book hero genre. So he wasn't necessarily the first superhero. In fact, Dr. Colt himself was not even the first superhero. There's been comic strips and so forth that were people with extraordinary abilities. But he was eventually became the most iconic superhero. Probably even today can arguably be the most iconic superhero in the history of comic books. Now, so that was probably their first character written for a major publication, was Dr. Occult. They still continued to work on Superman. Now, going back, I mentioned that Jerry Siegel was getting tired, so when he wrote that letter, that put a rift in both Jerry Siegel's and Joe Shuster's relationship. One could imagine your friend goes behind your back to search for a different artist. Joe Shuster did not take it well. He actually is said to have, and he claimed that he had destroyed all his concept art of Superman, ranging from Superman wearing just normal clothes to various different types of capes. For example, it said that he drew one was almost like a bat-like cape for Superman. So all these concept art were completely destroyed. Destroyed. So it would be, and so sadly we don't have those. I'm sure a lot of comic book historians would love to have at least a few surviving ones. During that time, Joe Shuster would destroy it. But like I mentioned, we'll go into, especially when I start going to Superman himself, we're going to go into exactly what influenced this character. And we'll go into a little bit further aspect of the people in the comic characters, that Superman himself, his powers, his villains. Ironically, well, not so ironic, but is another person that was very important in Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel's life was Jerry Siegel's future wife, who would become the model of Lois Lane. And I would explain later on why that was so important. But at some point, both Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster would sell their Superman character to National Comics. And so in 1938, the first comic book was published of Superman in Action Comics #1. So Action Comic #1, which is an iconic image in itself. You have Superman holding a car over someone's head, and you have this guy in the background here running away. Now, and if you watch the original Superman movie, he does something similar, and Supergirl in the TV series does something similar, and a lot of the Superman mythos, a lot of the Superman characters that came to be would do something similar, because this image is it's the first image of Superman in costume, and this would be the birth of Superman. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster sold the rights to Superman to National Comics for about $200 at the time. Not $200 at the time, but $200. But I think it rounds up to be a few $1,000 today. I'm not exactly sure the amount today, but now, as Superman's popularity grew, Jerry Siegel, and as well as Joe Shuster, but Jerry Siegel especially, became more and more disgruntled. He felt that they got the raw end of the deal, because here is a company making millions and millions of dollars off of something they created for very little. Now, at the time, Jerry Siegel, which, like I mentioned, was creating created Dr. Occult, so he was working for National Comics, both Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. But this idea that they got the raw end of the deal, eventually Jerry Siegel would talk with Joe Shuster, trying to convince him to, hey, let's take them to court. Let's see if we can get our rights back. Originally, they tried to buy the rights back, but eventually it would wind up going to court. Joe Shuster was actually originally was very hesitant because they both were still working for National Comics, and they weren't getting paid that much as it was, and by doing a lawsuit, they were potentially risking their careers, right? So they did take it to court, and National Comics won, right? Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel lost the lawsuit. Joe Shuster would lose his job because of this as well, and as well. Jerry Siegel would go would eventually come back to National Comics to work with them, but that left a very bad taste in probably both of their mouth, but sadly they didn't win. If you look at the history of the lawsuits pertaining to Superman, they have not been as successful with Superman himself in those lawsuits. Where they had been successful with in the lawsuit was pertaining to Superboy, and that's because National Comics did not get permission to use that work that Joe Shuster had, or Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster had created together. So they actually were more successful with Superboy. Eventually, Superboy would get bought out. They would buy the rights back from the Shuster and Siegel family for Superboy as well. So they lost that lawsuit, but this is why I mentioned that Jerry Siegel's future wife, would become so important, because after years and years by Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel, they were struggling, and especially Joe Shuster, who as he was getting older, was going blind. So when the movie Superman the movie was announced, about to come out in 1978. Before that, Jerry Siegel wrote a letter that he sent to various comic book writers, comic book authors, artists, and including Joe Shuster. And I think and this became one of the most important letters in comic book history. I mean, this is a letter discussing essentially cursing DC Comics for where he felt betrayed and used them, essentially. And he literally curses them in this letter. And I'm going to pull that up just so you can see part of that letter. So this is the letter, and he really states negative things. And it's this letter right here. While Joe Shuster learned of the movie that's coming out, that he decided to join his friend, and they both decided they wanted to do another lawsuit for the rights of Superman to get credits for what they wrote. Now, I mentioned this because when they did their first lawsuit, DC Comics, or National Comics at the time, stopped putting their names on the comics that on the character that they created, right? So there was no bylines created by Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel. Rather, they took their name off. It's not even until the 70s that they would at least have their names put back on the comic books. And again, and as I mentioned, when the movie came out, that was essentially the last straw for Joe Shuster. He got with Jerry Siegel, and they were going to do another lawsuit. But that letter didn't just reach Joe Shuster; it reached a lot of artists and writers in the comic book industry. And there's always an argument about artists and writers' rights, even today, especially with these large businesses and like DC Comics and Marvel. So Time Magazine had an artist named the name of Neil Adams, and it's Neil Adams, which I showed this earlier, who drew this cover. It's Neil Adams who introduced them to a lawyer. Additionally, Jerry Siegel's wife, the very image of Lois Lane, from the Golden Age up until through the Silver Age and so forth, really we're going out there trying to influence the public perception, because the reality is they probably were going to lose this lawsuit. It was pretty well known that they were likely not going to win this lawsuit. But what they did win in this, by showing especially with Joe Shuster, the struggles financially and health wise that he was going through, and that they were able to place, hey, this is what the company did to me, right? And it's that publicity, especially with a movie that's coming out, was really starting to worry DC, and they chose to essentially to arbitrate. They decided on some agreements pertaining to Superman. And in that agreements, Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel, for the rest of their life, would receive, I think, a yearly stipend, right, for the rest of their lives, and as well as some, like, they would pay for some of their health insurance and stuff as well. But eventually, for Joe Shuster, DC would decide to increase it, and they would also apply that to their immediate family members. So after they passed away, their wives and so forth, and I think some of their children, not so much the grandchildren, great grandchildren, but their children would be able to continue to benefit off of that. So it's very interesting. And I think it's great history. I couldn't go into every single detail pertaining to Superman or to Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster's life. I do recommend that you to read up on them, because they did have an interesting life. Their parents themselves had an interesting life, right? I think it's pretty fitting that one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that Joe Shuster said that he moved to California was so he could be closer to his friend. So although that wasn't the sole reason, because he was having a lot of health issues at the time, he was living with his cousin Frank, and it was Frank who suggested that he move back close to a friend, and Joe Shuster was like, yeah, that's a great idea. So he did eventually move to California, and Joe Shuster would eventually pass away in 1992, and Jerry Siegel would pass away a few years later in 1996. So I hope you enjoyed this YouTube video. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Next time I hope to go over start going over Superman himself. Take care, and God bless. Thank you. Bye.